News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Beres.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Beres with you on a Monday. I do hope you had a good weekend. We've got a good show to start things off this morning. I mean, obviously, our state lawmakers are busy working on a number of issues here that are going to come into play. And, some will pass, some won't. Some more controversial than others, and some affecting different parts of the state. Obviously, there's some that will affect us here in the city of Nashville across the board, some specifically with regard to that. And we're going to talk this morning about a broad range of issues that are maybe going before the Judiciary Committee, starting first with the Community Oversight Board and some legislation at the state level that could affect how this board, which those of you who live in Nashville voted to pass, will operate. And there's some controversy around that. So we'll start with that. We're going to get the phone lines open, and you're going to be invited to join in the conversation because we have the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Michael Curcio, with us this morning. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you on. And, behind the idea of the Community Oversight Board, we'll talk about some other issues as well as, I think criminal justice reform. Let me ask you a bit about medical marijuana, even though I don't think that's going to your committee at this point.
Sure.
But let's just start, and we may get some phone calls on this because a lot of people have strong opinions. When this passed, we want to see how it's going to operate. It's just getting up and running now. There's members now of the board.
Sure.
I think this legislation would, that's controversial, I guess, to some degree from here, would remove subpoena power, require reporting to the General Assembly, and limits the board to registered voters from the jurisdiction for which it serves. The one that jumps out at a lot of people is, well, this Community Oversight Board will take complaints sometimes, and they'll look into them with regard to actions of the Metro Police Department. And to compel someone to come forward and ask questions, having a subpoena helps forcing them to do that if they don't want to. Taking that away, they say, could affect their ability to do the job. So, just talk a little bit about the legislation and where that started from and where that came from.
Sure. So, to rewind a little bit, there's been a lot of questions and conversations around these community oversight boards in Tennessee over the last, say, 18 months. So Nashville, as you mentioned, voted to have a community oversight board, but they weren't the first. Knoxville's had one for over 20 years. Memphis has a board that functions very successfully in that city. But across the country, these have been around since the 1950s. And so as questions started coming in the summer months when we were out of session, from my district and from, I live just 35 miles from downtown Nashville, so my district is very close into Middle Tennessee, and we have even a lot of law enforcement folks who live in my community that commute into Nashville to work for Metro. And so as questions started coming in, I just asked a very simple, somewhat naive question of our legal folks of what does our Tennessee code say? How do we speak to community oversight boards? And what I was kind of surprised to find out is that we don't mention these at all. So there's no reference to them in the Tennessee Code, period. So we don't define them, we don't outline how they should function, and so forth. And so for something that's been around really, again, nationwide since the 1950s, I felt it was a bit of an oversight for us to not have any definitions or kind of outlines for these boards. So what we did was we went to the National Institute of Justice, which is a nonpartisan body that studies these boards across the country. They do many other things, but they have a report on these community oversight boards. And so they've been studying them for now some 50, 60 years. We've got a lot of life experience there. We've got a lot of trial and error of what works well, what does not work well in these various communities. And so what they've done is they've aggregated all those boards and they've said, here's what a really successful board looks like, here's some things that have worked well, here's some pitfalls that you might try to avoid. And so what our bill does, and it's a very short bill, if you've read it, it's little over a page, which has got just basically those 5 provisions, some of which you mentioned, that just create some standards and some guardrails within which these boards should function and operate. So there's been a lot of focus on the subpoena power issue, and it's unfortunate that folks are focusing on that because I think it does sort of distract from really what the main point of the bill is, which is just to create a statewide set of standards that apply to everyone equally. In Knoxville, for example, where their board has been in existence for a little over 20 years, they have had subpoena power, but it was interesting when their police chief came, who I respect greatly. She's been a wealth of knowledge on this topic. When she came to testify before the Judiciary Committee, she said in her own testimony, we weren't aware we had the subpoena power. I had to go back and read the charter amendment to see if we even had this power, because we've never used it. The reason they've not used it, and this is exactly what the NIJ report speaks to, is that when these boards are enacted, they're really enacted to give citizens a voice and a role in how they are being policed. But they're not intended to be investigative bodies. They're not intended to really to issue subpoenas and go after those types of investigations. That's really the purpose of the grand jury, and we have a very robust and functioning grand jury system in this state. They've got subpoena power, they've got attorneys, they've got research analysts, and so they can really get to the bottom of something when it looks like it really needs to be investigated. That's not the role of a community oversight board. And so many would argue, and certainly folks who are much well versed on these boards even than I am, that by giving a board of this nature subpoena power, they're actually undermining their stated purpose to begin with. Because if you're a police officer and we subpoena you to come before the board, you're already setting the wrong tone. It's adversarial. Your chief is going to require you to come anyway, because if the Community Oversight Board calls, then it's certainly the stated policy of the Nashville Metro Chief to say yes, they're going to come and speak. But when you subpoena an officer, oftentimes they're going to plead the Fifth Amendment, because at that point you've set up this adversarial process.
But that would only be the last resort subpoenaing them. You'd ask them first, and if they said no, and then if they plead the Fifth, that doesn't look good. It never looks good when you plead the Fifth.
But when you come,
you have a right to do that. But it never looks good.
But when you come forward and you've not been compelled, you're protected by what's called your garrity rights as a law enforcement officer. And so that means that they can speak freely about what happened, so that the board can get to the bottom of this incident, whatever it may be, and they have protection there to not be criminally liable in a civil case.
Now, it wouldn't always be law enforcement officers that would necessarily be subpoenaed.
That's exactly
right. It could be other folks. I'm wondering now, does the state have any financial stake in supporting any of these committees or the oversight boards across the state? In different cities, you guys don't pay any money to support any of these, right?
No, we don't. Yeah, they're completely.
So there's no financial stake. I mean, you could make the argument that why should the state stick their nose into this period when it's within each city to come up with a plan that they like? Well, and you have no money financially, and as you say, every city is different and may need different needs. I mean, why would the state stick their nose in that?
I'm glad you asked, because we want to make sure that if we've got boards in this state, they follow best practices, that they're the best in the business. And so why would we want to set up boards that are fundamentally flawed based on the review of 60 years of research? Instead, we can say, when we've got these boards in Tennessee, they're going to be the best in the business. They're going to conduct their affairs in a way that meets with those best practices.
You don't think the organizers of each of these boards in each of these cities looked at the same things you did?
Apparently not, if the charter amendments counter to the best practices recommendations.
And the best practices recommendations you said came from?
The National Institute of Justice.
Okay, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of different folks that look at how these are set up to see whether or not that's the best practice. So your belief, though, is that subpoena power would not be in the best practice because...
Moreover, it's not ever used. I mean, look at Knoxville. They've not used it in 20 years.
Then why bother with it?
Because it's sort of, it's a tool that is put in, it's a very blunt instrument. It's a tool that I think is written in as an afterthought. I don't think there's really an intention to say that you want an unelected board to be able to use this heavy of a hand. I don't think, again, if you look at these boards across the country, that's never really been the intent. In fact, in the report itself, it talks about how seeking subpoena power will get you in these long, protracted, fights and arguments. It'll erode the community trust between the community and the police, and it'll really get these organizers who try to create these boards in a position where they're starting off on the wrong foot already. And unfortunately, by going through this debate, we've sort of fulfilled that prophecy that the NIJ, I mean, so it's amazing how, every word of that report has really played out in this debate. And so for Nashville, for a city that I love and have always enjoyed being in and around growing up, again, just living here in the Middle Tennessee community, I really hope we can get past this very quickly, because I do think once the board gets up and running, it's going to function just fine. It's going to be a very healthy dialogue and process, just like it's been in Memphis, just like it's been in Knoxville, and we can get over this debate. But I think right now everything that we're doing is so charged up, and folks are just looking for a reason to say we've been, we've been wronged in some way, or we've been disenfranchised in some way. And it's unfortunate that this subpoena argument has really kind of gotten swept up in that, because we just want to create some standards and best practices and say within these guidelines, within these 5 points, do as you wish. We're not getting involved in the local control, the minutia of how many people can serve on the board or how often they should meet, what types of issues they should take up. We really want that to be the feel and the role of the community itself to say, how do you want this board to look? As long as you operate within these, basic standards.
All right, listen, we'll take a break on that. If you have a question or comment along those lines, jump in. The number 737-7587. If you're on hold, stay there. We can go more into some of the details on that, as well as some of the other issues that the Judiciary Committee will be looking at. We'll be back with more right after this. Stay with us.